Okay, so maybe now let's discuss this as a group and discuss what we thought about this. So what can we comment on the development stage, or what did teams have jotted down on development stage?
Even overall, I mean, what do you think are the key findings?
Yeah.
The landscape is fairly well distributed. I mean, even though there's many of these approved drugs, there are still companies willing to take a chance on developing new things, potentially.
No, that's spot on, because we see, I won't give the answer straight away, but that's exactly, no, but that was exactly what we had written down. Because firstly, you see big players such as AbbVie, Gilead, J&J, BMS, etc. at the approved space, but you also see them persist throughout the pipeline. So they are really kind of immunology giants with a very, very strong presence in the RA space. But also, if you look at the early stage pipeline, you do see a few more biotechs or smaller pharma emerging within that space. So if you are a biotech, or if you are a big pharma looking for an innovative asset, perhaps those are your potential targets to consider. But yeah, in terms of the development phase, that's one thing that we noted. All stages of development are very crowded by big pharma, with smaller companies and biotechs emerging earlier in the pipeline. What can we say on the mechanism of action? I won't pick on you, but so yeah.
If we want to make money, go for a biologic.
Yeah, multiple biologics.
Subcutaneous preferably.
Subcutaneous, okay. So what can you comment on the route of administration?
So what I noted is that, so you have biologics in approved, mostly subcutaneous plus intravenous, and that are those that are bringing also the biggest money in the pocket. So I would say if you want to be successful, probably these are those that were recently approved. So if you have to go back to the pipeline, you don't have something biologic, preferably with that route, probably have a less likelihood to be successful in the end.
Okay, but what about if they're pursuing a longer term strategy, or if they want to enter this market in a 3 to 5 year timeline maybe? What would you say about phase 2 potentially? Especially with route of administration. So I think one thing we saw here is, if we look at phase 2s, we're seeing a lot of circles representing oral. So there's a bit of a trend that we can see here, that oral drugs are emerging as a competitive threat to IV and subcutaneous. You're completely right, the trend is moving away from IV to subcutaneous at the moment in the approved space. But as we look at the pipeline, we actually see another shift in that we can anticipate, moving from subcutaneous to oral. And a lot of these, if we look at these trials, of course, if you know the RA space, if we look at these trials, these oral drugs are trying to show similar efficacy and safety to be on par to these IV and subcutaneous assets. So that's kind of a shift we're seeing as we look deeper into the pipeline. Again, if we look at the MOA in the approved space, completely right, it's dominated by biologics, but also anti-TNFs, JAK inhibitors, B and T cell inhibitors, etc. But if we look at the pipeline, we're seeing more novel players come up as well. For instance, BTK inhibitors, which are shown in a little turquoise, like as you can see here, including by BMS. Another one is, I guess, chemokine inhibitors as well, which are represented in pink, of course, in a bit more of an earlier stage, but we have a few more biotechs looking into that as well. So that's another trend to look at if you look at the colors and how those are distributed as well.
I have a question here. So you have phase 2, you have a lot of oral solid dose administration. Phase 3, you have none. And then you have the approved one, and you have still back oral solid doses. Do you have a constraint in the phase 3? How many failures do you have by oral solid?
I think it's just more, I don't think there was a hurdle per se for phase 3, it was just the way that the landscape is moving.
Because they were not in that,
so
they are shifting.
There is a shift, yeah. And again, as Meva called out, class effects are also playing out, right? So for instance, all of these orals at the moment are actually JAK inhibitors. So although there are oral opportunities in the space, there are some concerns regarding JAKs, which are encouraging earlier stage players to look at other MOAs as well. But yeah, no particular.
That's curious that they have an oral and as a mode of administration they have JAKs. Because it seems probably it's the only one that works with an oral solid formulation.
JAK inhibitor, yeah, because biologics again pose
So
that
if
problem.
the others are not disclosed, then I wonder what is the percentage of failure or success going through phase 3. But anyway.
But this is a fair question, I think, and this is something that we do also as follow-up from the landscape, because normally you do the landscape, but then you also look at failures, like what has failed and what. So you look back, depending how many years, that's depend on the landscape, you know, and how long it takes normally to develop a drug, but usually you look back like 5 years, and often cases, the slide next to this is a slide of what has failed and, you know, what you can learn from there. So yeah, no, I think it's a fair comment. In order to have a complete overview of the landscape, you also need to see that.
Definitely. And another trend actually in the RA space is with these approved assets, as you can see from the sales figures, they are huge assets and big standard of care. How this is now translating into the landscape is there are now more and more kind of head-to-head trials or are being mandated to show non-inferiority to current standard of care. So this is again the data requirements to progress through the various stages of trials is also becoming more stringent, at least in this space, based on what we're seeing. But yeah, I think these were the key trends that we wanted to call out. Oh, sorry.
Does anybody here works in RA? And would anybody agree or agree or disagree before we move?
So there's a few comments maybe we could make. If you could quickly go back to the landscape, what we're seeing here is a snapshot in time looking at the start of this month. That's the current landscape as it stands. This is just what we believe to be active drugs. What we haven't looked at, and you just referred to that, is how has the RA landscape evolved over time? Is it growing? Is it shrinking? More and more companies investing and going in here, or are they exiting? And again, we haven't yet started to talk about the commercial factors, but you can see it's the big players and there's some serious money here. So is there any room whatsoever for you to play with something innovative? Or is there such slim pickings to be had that it just makes no sense, because the barriers that you would face are going to be enormous if you've got a huge pharma company with a huge selling drug and follow-up drugs to try and maintain their market share, and they've got the existing relationship with the payers. You're really up against it, and to your point about the the comparison trials, the head-to-head trials, it's a brave small company, or a brave any company that would want to do, say, a head-to-head with Humira.
Oh yeah.
Because it's a massive extra cost to just showing, useful efficacy. It's a high risk game, and I don't think many people would want to play it. So again, snapshot in time, is this evolving? Again, if you were to look at the different MOAs that we've got here, there's this trend of moving towards oral. Is that just because there's nowhere to play in the biologic space, so that's how you're going to differentiate? Lower price, maybe different line of treatment. But then you start looking at the MOAs for the oral drugs, and you start seeing the clusters. You've got the JAK inhibitors on the market, you've got BTK inhibitors coming through. You already pointed out that you've got some really big players in phase 2 and beyond. It already looks pretty challenging before you even start saying, well, this is an interesting MOA, this is novel, this is a smaller company.
Yeah.
If they got any room to play, would be, again, it's a huge question to ask.
And precisely that, if you have a very good and robust and comprehensive competitive landscape, you will be able to answer those kind of questions that Andrew, you are asking. But you need to start We all need to
Yeah.
start from here. But
And
thank
that's
you for
another great point that you mentioned regarding Humira, which is another external factor that again, this is just 10 small questions. If I'm not mistaken, I think Humira biosimilar is not far at the moment. So the RA landscape is actually, has a generic threat of Humira biosimilars entering within the next 5 years, which again could shift this completely. So again, re-emphasizing the fact that this has to be refreshed, or it can't be a static landscape that we look at. But this was just basically say these were our implications that we drew, essentially what we discussed. What are the next steps? So are we going to deep dive into a single asset, maybe look at the clinical trial data, which patients you want to look into, or deep dive into the manufacturers, or are we actually saying, this is too crowded, or this doesn't look like an attractive opportunity for me, so we're no longer going to pursue this. So these are the types of next steps we may work with that particular stakeholder. This is a different example, and I'll hand it over to Maeva.
I'm just going to take this. So this is the second case study that we wanted to show you. So the last one, so it's a bit different. So here we have a stakeholder who's coming to us and wants to evaluate us to best design their pivotal trial for a TIGIT PD-L1 combo, and they want basically to understand upcoming competitors' launches in non-small cell lung cancer, so NSCLC. So again, very vague ask. So there's some clarification question that needs to be asked. So again, with this, it's a slightly different scope. So what kind of question would you ask to this stakeholder to best kind of do your landscape analysis and kind of tailor a format? Do you have any idea of some question? No, maybe go back. Yeah, maybe.
Let's go.
No? You think this is very clear and we can kind of proceed?
There's lots of questions you can always ask.
Yeah. So for instance, if you want to narrow down a bit the scope or understand a bit more within this huge indication that is NSCLC, what you want to focus on, maybe Rakili, or maybe you have a few questions.
So one obvious one is, so we're talking about combination here. Are we talking about the same company owning both of those assets, or are they partnering with someone else that maybe has a PD-L1 already on the market?
Yeah.
That's a key one because it really changes the dynamic. And then, as you said, NSCLC is huge, so you've got all kinds of different things you're going to want to find out. But I guess that's probably part of the ask, is for them to segment, or for you to do the work, to segment this massive landscape into something that becomes more manageable and more obvious of where the opportunities might lie, or where the competitors seem to be heading.
No, that's a very good point, and that's actually the first step we did, because sometimes if you do like the whole NSCLC landscape, it's going to be an information overflow. You're just going to have, like 100 trials, but then you don't really know how to interpret that or to actually act upon that. So, we asked some of these key questions, so on point. So, for instance, is there a specific line of therapy? So in oncology, it's usually by line of therapy. So first line, are you looking more to go to the neoadjuvant setting? Then you want to understand whether you really focus on understanding these TIGIT competitors, or if you want to take a step back and look at the whole NSCLC first line landscape. What is the time frame for this research? Because you want to look at upcoming competitors' launches, but do you want to look in the next 10 years, in the next 2 years? That's going to stratify your research as well. And then also in terms of geography, are you interested in TIGIT like investigated globally? Are there specific markets where you want to enter, and then you want to identify your competitor there? So these are some of the clarification we got from this stakeholder. So interested in first line, NSCLC, really interested in TIGIT, so that's what they're developing. They want to understand every trials in ongoing in first line NSCLC involving TIGIT. So both a company who has both the TIGIT and the PDL1, but also if it's from different companies. What is the time frame they want to understand by 2025, because maybe that's when their drug is going to launch. And then in terms of the market focus, the US and Europe are going to be really key for our stakeholder. So that's some of the clarification we got. So now that we have a bit more idea about what exactly is needed, we can start thinking about our methodology. So we have a little exercise. So how would you proceed with this ask? So what kind of metrics or data points would you look for to best inform stakeholder why? If you have any idea about databases that could be used, and how would you basically tailor this landscape, like in terms of format or what you want to display? Because you cannot put everything, you need to kind of tailor analysis, otherwise it's just information overflow. So we can give you maybe a few minutes to think about that.
Yeah, maybe if we go to the previous slide,
Yeah.
we can start with what metrics we now know based on the specific scope that they've outlined. Sorry, one of them. Oh,
Yeah.
oh, don't give it away yet.
Ah,
There we
yeah,
go.
exactly.
Okay, so that's why we're
heading.
heading. So, what information do we know now, or what little granular details have they added that's now going to help us frame this? And again, maybe just shout out if you spot it already.
Yeah, and based on the answer as well from the previous slide that we had. So for instance, we could go first with like the metrics, like what do you think is going to be important to understand these upcoming competitors' launches? Yeah. Do you want some time to think, or should we kind of
Give
go
us
straight
some
in?
metrics. Sorry, I keep picking on you.
Always me, but
I know, it's
Because
because
you're
you're directly in
front,
front of me.
TIGIT plus PDL1 couple.
Yeah. So they specified that. So we know they want to look at both TIGIT and PD1s. Maybe table in the center. Could we have another metric that you can now spot based on what they've said?
The 1L setting.
First line setting, exactly. So now again, we haven't gone away and looked at the entire NSCLC landscape. We're just looking at first line. Table at the back.
Development stage, I guess, because if we want to launch
Yeah.
in 2025, it has to be late stage.
It has to be late stage, and again with oncology, this could be a phase 2 as well. So that's definitely something a key word to keep in mind. Table in the back there. One more.
The geography.
Yeah. No, definitely. Well, you're all really on point. Is there anyone else who had some suggestion?
I'm gonna pick on Alex.
Ah.
Any suggestion, Alex?
I was looking to see if there were any other Alex. The assumption in terms of the MOA, so we say wants to map TIGIT competitors. How do we define TIGIT competitors?
So, for instance, what we do usually the first stage is that we're going to look at all drugs that have TIGIT as a mechanism of action, and that's the one we're really going to be focusing on when we're searching through our databases. So, our direct competitors basically are the one in scope to come back to our methodology. So perfect.
Yeah, I think we've taken.
I think very on point. So from the little clarification we got, exactly focus on TIGIT, want to understand the market time of launch in the US and EU, and NSCLC first line. So this is about the scope. But then when we think a bit about the metrics, so as we mentioned, mechanism of action, because we're interested also in launch timelines, things that are going to be important are when is the trial primary completion date, because that's going to give you a good information. Is there any guidance on filing and approval from your competitors to best understand when it may launch on the market? Regarding like the geographical scope, you want to understand, look at clinical trial sites. Is it like a US only trial? Is it a global trial? Is it a Chinese trial? Because for instance, if your trial is only in China, it might be a bit more difficult to file in the US because you need to show that your drug also works in the US patient population. So those are all important things. And the last one we wanted to call out is that they're interesting, our stakeholder is interested in kind of trial design because they want to know what's doing, so we can give a bit more granularity on that front and add, for instance, is there a chemotherapy backbone that is being used? Is there some kind of biomarker stratification of the patient? So those are more kind of granular details that could also help inform our clients' ask. So that's our little answers. Going back to database, and that's exactly to your point. So here we need to look at phase 3, of course, but in oncology, phase 2 are also important. We are not going to go through all phase 2 because phase 2 is just massive in NSCLC. So to gauge a bit, the registrational potential, you can look at company guidance because sometimes companies actually declare that they want to try and find on this. You can look at how many patients there are because you usually need a large trial. If there's 50 patients, very unlikely they will be able to file, as well as your primary endpoint. So those are all considerations you want to take. You're looking at industry-sponsored trial. So we put down a few kind of bullet point lists just to make the research more efficient, because if you go through all NSCLC, then it's going to take hours to go through that. You want to look at ongoing trials, not things that have been discontinued, obviously. And then the next step for this one, so the next step for this one is what we mentioned about predicting launch. So you can have internal assumption based on other assets or combo, how long it's taken them to go through the regulatory process. But the best guidance is always the one from the company. Did the company state that they are actually already filed? So then you can update your guidance. Did they mention when they expect the asset to launch? So all of this is an extra step of research that can be taken for time and slide. And the final one is this designation, so regulatory designation, because if an asset has got breakthrough therapy designation, may be more likely to get priority review, and then it could get faster to market. So this is also one aspect that when looking at launch timelines, you need to check.
And one thing that's not here at the moment is, of course, conferences are such a key area where you can collect all of this information as well and get a real sense of, especially as Meba talked about phase 2, you can get the buzz there at the conference as well as, is this going to be registrational after seeing the data? What is the buzz? What are people thinking? What is the company communicating there? But yeah, these are databases that we're talking about, but conferences, again, is a very key source.
Exactly, and also to do primary intelligence is very important because you can get more information that maybe you're not going to get in the secondary. So also conferences are really helpful for that. Yes?
Yeah, I would just comment that perhaps an additional factor to consider in terms of the sort of the post-approval, because you've got there is launch timelines, whereas I tend to see launch, especially ex-US, in terms of HTA.
Yeah, that's true in Europe.
So you're not talking in terms of just because it's approved by the European Commission, the market authorization has been designated. Ultimately, in terms of a launch, shall we say, implementation, then you're not going to really see that until the respective countries sort of have agreed. And typically, you get Germany or some of the markets in Northern Europe tend to sort of have the reimbursed launch first. But there's a huge variation, shall we say.
No, that's a very good point. Actually, our advice is that this project was, it's kind of mostly focused on the US, but yeah, in Europe, even if you get EMA approval, if in the end, in France, the HTA is not going to reimburse it, in the end, no patient will benefit from it, so it's not going to enter this market. And that's where it gets also important to update and to kind of monitor, because you need to check this HTA newsletter or this Gazeta to try to find out when it will actually get like a reimbursement notification.
And
so
for example, some of the technology review agencies, in effect, if it's an orphan drug or a drug in terms of where there's significant unmet need, then ultimately that may expedite the process in terms of getting that reimbursement status. So.
No, that's a very good point. It's all to include people that are not inside.
Yeah.
But that's thank you for all your answers. So this is an example of a landscape that we could do. It's quite busy, so we can walk you through it. So what you can see on the far left side, so we clearly state that we're looking at first line. Then when we look here, we can see the key competitors in the near to mid-term. So we're in our 2025 timelines with the logos, so Merck, Roche, Beijing, all these competitors clearly stated. Then you have the regimen, of course, which is color-coded. Because we want to inform a bit on trial design, we also look at these more granular details about chemo backbone. Is it chemo-free? If the TIGIT are being investigated without chemo, do they actually stratify the patient in any way? So for instance, here it's a lot based on PD-L1 status. And then we put, of course, on legend. And as you can see, there are these clear timelines with the different trial names. It's linked, and then we use little symbols to estimate when it may file in Europe, when it may file in the US. As for instance, US is here in green, and EMA is more kind of in red. So this is just to give a snapshot. Also the phase 2, we clearly flag which one are phase 3 versus phase 2 because phase 2 sometimes it's maybe a bit more difficult to file on this versus the competitors who are actually doing these big pivotal trials. So we want it to stand out. And the trial site location, so you want to understand like, do they actually have trial sites in the US and EU, which are our markets of interest? Because if it's only, for instance, in Asia, that's really going to impact their ability to actually launch, or they may need to do a bridging study, so that gets a bit more tricky. And this is, our timeline, so 2025. Here, as you can see, we also put trials that are going further beyond 2025, and that's because these are companies who are actually trying 2 different strategies for TIGIT, so this is something we wanted to call out. So for instance, for Roche, you have 2 different trials, the skyscraper arm 1 and 6. One is with chemo, one is without chemo, so it's important to understand also how committed they are to the TIGIT space through this. So this is a bit what we do, and then the last thing we really wanted to call out is that this landscape are a bit different from the one Gita mentioned before in terms of when you need to update it, because this is very time sensitive. This is a space that's moving really quickly. Because we are talking about launch timelines, you always need to follow your competitors' press release, filings. You want to understand if they got any designation. So this is something that needs to be updated a bit more regularly. And that's why it's important to clearly state when it's been last updated, just to make sure that the stakeholders actually are taking decision based on something that's really up to date. And the other thing is that when talking about launch timelines, you can use case study to use that, or you can base that on company guidance, but it's important to state all your assumptions as well as how you stratify the research, just so that people know what's been excluded, what's been included. So these are few considerations.
On the last point in particular, I just want to add that these type of landscapes are great for analog identification. So you can identify an analog and the clinical trial as well as regulatory path that they followed and apply those assumptions for a particular asset that you're tracking, where the company may not necessarily be as vocal about their plans. So yeah, and again, these can be built as more and more assets start kind of going through these loopholes. And as Mavis said, it's all quite time sensitive, so it's important to keep building on those assumptions and caveating that very clearly, because yeah, it's not set in stone.
Yeah, and the assumption vary greatly also depending on the therapy area that we're looking at, because now we're looking at oncology, and in oncology, I'm not saying that it's easy to do the assumption, but you have a lot of examples, right? When you are in a rare disease or where you're looking in, weird markets. I mean, I have the example of a lot of Korean companies. They say something, but then, how much you can trust. It depends also on the field and what the therapy is. So I think like our range of assumption is quite big, and the most important thing is what Meta said, that we need always to clearly state where our assumption, come from. And yes, and sometimes, there are situations where you need to have a risk case and the base case, for example.
No, that's a good point, and it's the same in rare disease. They often have a lot of hurdles with recruiting patients because all the trials are competing and there's not too many patients. So even if the company said they will file in 2023, it's most likely there are going to be some delay because it's really difficult to recruit for this kind of trials. So then you need to adopt a more granular details where you're going to look exactly at how many patients they're enrolling through primary intelligence. So in these cases, it's a bit more complex. This is for oncology, and yeah, we do have a lot of examples for that. And then the point is just to draw what are the findings from this. You look at who may launch first, so it looked like Roche, what at the trial we would complete the earliest, but that's where it's important to follow the news because there have been some news about Skyscraper 01 and which may really impact their ability to launch, but they're also conducting a further overall survival analysis, so you really need to follow the news to make sure to understand the probability of success of the trial. And you can look also at ARC7, which is a phase 2 trial, and you can say that while it looks like it may be second or first to market, depending on Skyscraper outcome, we have to caveat it's kind of a phase 2 trial, and it has PFS as an endpoint, so regulatory agencies sometimes are a bit more careful with that. So this is, from this landscape, it's really to inform, quickly enable the findings, and then, as with the area landscape, the next step can be further deep dives into specific trials, conduct primary intelligence to know exactly how it's going. So there's a lot of steps you can take. But as an initial step, it can be very informative. So I think that's the two main case studies we wanted to walk through today. But I don't know if I give you like this. Yeah. We wanted to show some other example of.
I think for conclusions, I think our main takeaway we want to say is be creative. This is a very snazzy slide capturing a Parkinson's disease landscape, just for disease-modifying therapies. I'm looking at Raquel because I think she put it together. But yeah, it's not our typical.
In the slide, so we went for the score.
There we go. So yeah, we went for it didn't all fit in our usual format. So Raquel came up with this beautiful slide.
Well, beautiful, I don't know, but sometimes the request is I want to see everything in a slide. Yeah. Because it depends how you need to look at things. So sometimes you need the details, but we do appreciate that sometimes you need one slide. So in this case, in order to make sense of it, we went with the square.
Could you just explain the different axes, why those different axes were chosen?
Yeah, so you have, firstly, in terms of the color, you have this actually detailing the target population. So it's early Parkinson's, advanced, broad, or GBA1 mutation. And again, depending on the landscape that you're looking into, stratifying by patient population gets more important, especially here with Parkinson's disease. So yeah, that's basically the colors and what they represent. Luckily, we don't have a metric with shape here, so it's slightly easier to work with. The boxes represent phases, with the center being launch, then you have phase 3, phase 2, and phase 1. And the dotted lines basically represent the targets. So this particular quadrant is multiple targets. The top quadrant is alpha synuclein target. And the left-hand side is all other single target. And at this point, we didn't break it down per target. We just wanted to give the brief overview. Raquel, do you have anything else to add?
No, another request that I just feel like it's slightly different. It was a request on design, because when you put together the slides, sometimes, we put together the landscape and then the client is like, okay, I'm not at the stage where I can pay for a full-on project, but I want to update the slide myself. So if you put a lot of elements, like in the first landscape that you've seen, and you have loads of shapes, you touch one and everything moves, and it's a disaster, and then a lot of clients feel like they want to cry. So in this case, for example, the little sidebar is like a bullet point, so it moves with the image. So in terms of being creative, sometimes it's also being creative in that way of making slides that are easy to maintain and someone can quickly make a change, someone that is not necessarily us. So we try to work with our clients also with this kind of things, because ultimately, this needs to be useful to you. Yeah.
So yeah. Oh, I didn't know we had that, but okay. So final best practices that we just jotted down. Of course, we touched on be creative, but tailor the approach as needed. We don't think it's a one-size-fits-all model when building a landscape. You really have to listen to your stakeholder, as you saw with the case studies, see what they want, and tailor your approach accordingly based on the objectives. Identify the key metrics. So if your stakeholder is being vague, go back to them and ask them that question again to say, tell me more, tell me why you want to do this, what are you looking to achieve, etc. Establish that before you go ahead and dive into building a landscape. Strategic group analysis is one of the frameworks that we use constantly with every single landscape. So what is the level of granularity that you require? For instance, as with Raquel's landscape here, they didn't really want to know every single target, they just wanted to know an overarching kind of view. So to that extent, what level of granularity makes sense? And yeah, to kind of identify the key trends. Regular updates are needed. It's not a static document. What frequency is this? What's the cadence going to be? If it's going to be a live cadence, are there ways that we can automate this to make sure that we're not moving a dot each time there's a news happening? But yeah, have that established so that it doesn't get lost and you don't look at an outdated document and derive the wrong kind of trends that was maybe relevant a year ago. Triangulate information. So we typically overcome the weakness of a single database by using information from multiple databases, supplemented by primary research or conference coverage as required. So always triangulate your information, especially with some databases. There may be some time lags in which information is uploaded. So bear that in mind as well in terms of the pros and cons of using the right databases. But yeah. Thank you so much for your attention. I know that we've been talking to you for quite a while. We'd just like to pause now to see if you have any questions or any comments on what we've presented today.
Thank you for your participation as well. It's good that it was very interactive.
Maybe one thing to mention is that what they've seen today is the final product, but a lot of time before actually showing a slide, sometimes what we do, we put together like Excel files with all the products and way more details about the single products and why to choose one or another. So, you know, there are different approaches also to arrive to
the ultimate.
That ultimate, yeah.
Any questions at all or any comments?
Yeah, we will be sharing the slides. So, well, once again, thank you, Aparjita, and thank you, Neva. Thank you all for coming and enjoying and sharing this day with us.